What are your DNA tests actually telling you? The answer is probably not a great deal, at least not if you're using it for the following reason. It will tell you a great deal if you're using a DNA test for medical purposes. Now, they're not perfect, there are risks involved, there are ethical dilemmas, there are all sorts of things we could get into. But let's just say there are some valid uses for DNA tests in the medical sphere. What is then the other use? It is, of course, ancestry is it's a major factor in that sort of market for genetic ancestry DNA tests. And what many of the less scrupulous companies are promising is that you will find out who you really are and who your ancestors really were. And they don't mean, here's the genetic profile of your ancestors. They somehow promise you the cultural identity. They present a whole package, as it were, for you. This is who you are, who you really are. Also as if the self you currently inhabit is somehow not fully authentic until you know this information and act on it. I have to say, the whole thing comes across as very US, American, of United States provenance. Not exclusively, but why do I say that? It's very much a similar logic to, oh, actually, I'm Italian, says, a US tourist who goes to Rome. And the Italian goes, oh, okay, where were you born? Well, the US. Okay, but, that's fine. So your parents, where in Italy are they from? Oh, they're not from Italy. Ah. Also, you don't speak Italian? No. Ah, okay. Your grandparents were Italian? And maybe, best case scenario, they say, one. Okay. But in many cases, the answer will be, oh, no, my great-great-grandparents were from Italy on one or both sides. Okay. There's very little in the way of Italian tradition in the house, if any at all. You see what I mean? It's sort of a thing, a reified descent notion that's been passed down to say to the next generation, we are actually Italian. And, and this comes out of, or Irish or German or what have you. And some of these groups maintained closer cultural ties for longer, and especially in some parts of the US, indeed, Italians and Germans, and indeed Irish, maintained very close links with the motherland, so to speak. And then slightly different stories, as well, with, say, Chinese or Japanese immigrants on particularly the West Coast, but also other places, etc., etc. We could get into all the particularities. Please don't write in and say, oh, but in my family. Yes, I understand. Right? It's not that simple, but you get the point. And it's a known phenomenon. It's a known phenomenon that US tourists come to parts of Europe, especially, and they say, I really am this. And it does actually rub a lot of local people the wrong way. Not everybody, but most, let's be honest. Now, whether or not that's right, there's a reason for that. It comes across as inauthentic because a lot of people think, okay, my culture is what I do every day. This is my culture. And cultures can indeed change, of course, or be quote-unquote lost, meaning that replaced with other cultural traditions, etc. This is the scenario. In the US, culture is seen somehow as ancestry, and it's the same. And it's not that it's never seen that way in other parts of the world, but this is a really strong factor within the sort of fittingly or ironically, depending on how you want to see it, that is itself part of US culture, is to treat culture in this very peculiar way. We could also get into a whole other conversation about ethnicity and what that word means in the US, which is different than what it historically means in Europe, I would say, or at least recent history. Okay, having gone through all that, where do we find ourselves? How do we get back to DNA tests? DNA tests are promising you that, in a sense. They're promising to tell you had suspicions you didn't know. The US is a very mixed place. People people are US American, very strongly in identity, politics, accent, everything. It's a very strong identity, actually, and yet it's always built out of these component bits of, like, where did your family really come from? When did they come over? How, etc. is built into a lot of people's concept of their Americanness. And so in order to find that out, and in order to validate that part of you, you need to go to something that is proof of that. Now, going back to this example of we're really Italian, or we're really Irish, or we're really German, or what have you, if the traditions, if the language, if basically all aspects of that person's life are absent from or rather that all aspects of the Irishness or the Italianness or the Germanness are absent from that person's life, that family tradition, etc., if they are not in any way practicing, doing things, enacting culture that is Irish or Italian or German, then what do they have left? They say, but by blood or genetically or etc., and they use these arguments. Now, this is actually quite common, an argument in the United States, in North America, and the Americas, perhaps more generally, again, maybe because of the particular history. But again, it's not probably quite the same as it's used in most of the world, these terms, and even if it was used in Europe at a certain time, that certain time is probably not a time we're keen to go back to, so to speak, i.e. it comes across as very sort of 1920s to me, and I think to a lot of other people. Now, it seems a benign form thereof, but is it so benign to truly think in these terms of basically of discernible quote-unquote races or ethnic groups or nations that are purely blood or blood and soil, right? And all of this, you can get into some quite stark things. Just look at the 20th century and you'll see this sort of logic is associated with particular ideologies and particular ways of carving up existence, let's say. Now, it's not anything other than well-meaning, I'm sure, on the part of these people, but it has created a market, and a market which is not really even questioned very much, especially not in the United States, of doing these tests to find out the truth about yourself, because blood is thicker than water, and blood tells you everything, and this is the secret, and blood is culture. And that's sort of the idea, right? This is what certainly in Europe we'd got away from until recently, is this notion that culture equals your sort of biological destiny, and these are two things, and that therefore there's a sickness, there's a mismatch when these two things aren't the same, which of course ignores everything we know about history, anthropology, etc., the entire long march of history and how cultures change, and the fact that culture, whether it be language or cooking or what have you, is of course just that. These are traditions which are beautiful and interesting, but they don't sort of come out of the sort of proteins that build up the body, if you see what I mean. They're not genetic. They're culture. That's the whole point. They are things that are learned. They are ways of doing things. They are community practices, all of that. And that's the point. When cultures come together, they can trade them. When cultures come together, one can be lost and replaced with another, etc. It's not that unity between so-called blood and so-called culture and tradition is anything but straightforward. These things are in constant flux, and humans are able to transmit these left, right, and center without, swapping genes. And it can also go together that there can be a blended culture in a blended household with two people who, might be reasonably placed in two different quote-unquote genetic groups, whatever that means, but obvious that they're not from the same part of the world originally, and all of this. And so what? I suppose it's a beautiful thing, but what I mean is so what, in the sense of, where does that leave us? Are you then to say that it is somehow quote-unquote biological, and that that's separate from culture, and that you doing a DNA test is going to tell you that you're secretly some living group. So that's another thing too, is if you go back far enough and say, oh, well, you know, our family in the Middle Ages or something had, you know, this or that ancestry, you go, okay, but so that's not your culture. That's not, then that culture doesn't exist anymore in anybody from, you know, from that time now, because no one's alive then, right? That's the whole point. Is so modern Britain is very different from medieval Britain. You know, Han Dynasty China is quite different from current China, etc. Now, sorry if this seems rambling, but the whole point is the following. These things are all just component parts of people's notions of identity, and the so-called biological is just that. It is, you know, it is the blood, but it isn't the culture, so to speak, to use that parlance. And so I fear the sort of simplicity of these DNA tests and the ones that sell you an ancestry with it. A modern day ancestry based on historic, you know, genetic transmission. It's not the same. It's completely illogical. And at best, it's harmlessly illogical. And at worst, it's incredibly dangerous. And so I don't think that this is an industry worth supporting. And I don't think it's one that we should allow to sort of innovate our public discourse about ancestry or the relationships of people today. Patrick Geary, a famous historian who's collaborated with, of the Middle Ages, of migrations in the early Middle Ages and collapse of the Roman Empire sort of time, he wrote on a group called the Lombards, and the Lombard is a name that sort of traveled all over Europe and was associated with various different places and various different time periods. And he said something which I think sums up quite well, is that if you excavate a skeleton and it's got certain grave goods which we associate with the label Lombard, you still can't tell if that person, that skeleton, is the skeleton of a quote-unquote Lombard person. You don't know how they're identified. You don't know what they actually did with their lives, and all you know is that some grave goods in their grave are associated with this culture. We don't know why. Maybe they liked them. Maybe that was a prestige object. Maybe they traded with the Lombard. You see what I mean? It's never that simple. And if you do a DNA test, what does that tell you? Even if their ancestors came from, say, north and the Lombards came from the north, that still doesn't tell you 100% sure that that group did anything, or that person belonged to that group. Maybe they were a genetic outlier. Maybe they were adopted into that and their culture was 100% Lombard, but they were from somewhere else, or vice versa. You see my point. It's never that simple. And please, for God's sake, these are incredibly unscientific DNA tests. And it belies, or rather gives sort of life to a whole host of lazy assumptions about both society and science, so to speak, with a capital S each. And we probably shouldn't be spending our money on them. At any rate, unscripted as this was, slightly rambly, I think you get my point. Feel free to leave some comments, and let's talk further about this. But be careful, for the path is fraught with danger. Take care, friends. Ciao for now, and see you later. Bye.